We're in the middle of a little ambitious study we have called the History of the World. As we've been seeing, if we compare the biblical picture of history with the accepted picture of history, there are a few areas of agreement, but there are many areas of disconnect, aren't there? And I believe the greatest disconnect is the issue of human origins. Where did human beings come from? What's the accepted position? The accepted position is that first there was life. Don't ask them how that happened. Trust me, it just happened. Began with single-celled organisms, then they moved up to amoeba and multi-celled organisms. And then these beings evolved, kept evolving into primates. Apes, chimpanzees, lemurs, and then the orangutan. The orangutan supposedly was an important development because the orangutan was the highest primate from which a new being called Cro-Magnon developed in Africa. And that Cro-Magnon in Africa was called the first human being. So the catchphrase for evolutionists is, out of Africa. That's where the human beings came from. Those were the Cro-Magnon men, they say. They were human beings, they say, but they were extremely primitive looking. If you look at your handout with those lovely pictures, Roz got upset at me, and Roz told me from now on, next time I use his picture, to ask permission first. So sorry again, Roz. I won't, but you got to admit it is a good likeness.
It really is. It's just like me.
The being at the top, see those three lovely people? Those are illustrations of Cro-Magnon men. Now, as I've been saying, I'm more and more convinced that evolutionists are racist. Yep, they are. Because I'm starting to catch on that what they call primitive appearance means don't look like Caucasians. But back to the accepted worldview, from this Cro-Magnon, we had the primates, and then we had the Cro-Magnon man. Now, there's an intermediate step there I'm going to talk about today between the primates, the orangutan, and the Cro-Magnon. And that is called Pithecus. P-I-T-H-E-C-U-S. Sometimes it's prefaced by a location like Australopithecus would mean the Pithecus found in Australia. So we have primates, then we have this transition figure called the Pithecus, which is half man, half ape. They do call it the missing link. In fact, Pithecus is frequently called the transition, the missing link. That is Pithecus. It's always used as a suffix. Primates, Pithecus, and then first human being, Cro-Magnon, in Africa. Then, from Africa, these Cro-Magnons started moving up and they merged into Neanderthals. Then the Neanderthals evolved into what we know as Homo sapiens. You must say that quickly again. We have the animals, primates. We have the Pithecus, transition. Then we have the Cro-Magnon, the first human being. Very primitive, though. Then Neanderthal, somewhat more modern looking. And then Homo sapiens. So from Africa, human beings started pumping out. I think of Africa in the accepted review of evolution. Africa is like a pump that pumped out these Cro-Magnons as they merged into Homo sapiens. But Neanderthals are only found in Europe. Hold that thought. Now, the accepted view is this. As that evolution happened, it corresponded to ages, such as the Stone Age. Stone Age is divided up. Old Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, New Stone Age. Then the Bronze Age. And then the Iron Age. Accompanying evolution were those ages. I'm going to point out today there's a little problem with that, in that where were those ages? Hold that thought too. Now, according to the accepted worldview, as human beings evolved, through their own evolution and through the ages. Also, their manner of life evolved. They began as hunters, gatherers, and then moved up to agriculture. Their housing evolved. First, they lived out in the open in the trees like the rest of the primates. Then they moved to caves, then primitive dwellings. And according to the accepted view of history, there were several ice ages. The problem they have is that the dates of these ice ages and the locations vary widely with whatever book you choose. That's pretty much the accepted worldview, everything I just said, the view of history. But there are many, many problems. In fact, I would say that there are many problems with that view that are deal killers. And as we saw last week, the best place to find the problem with that whole accepted view of evolution is to look at the evolutionists themselves, read what they say. You'll recall last week I brought a whole page of quotes from evolutionists. What did they do? They undermined their own position. And unwittingly, you'll remember those evolutionists exactly confirm what the Bible says. I'm going to review quickly what we learned last week from evolutionists. We learned 5 things. Again, not from the Bible, from evolutionists. The first thing we saw last week, evolutionists say that there is no evidence at all of the transition from Cro-Magnon to Neanderthal to Homo sapiens. There are 0 transition fossils, starting from Cro-Magnon going to Neanderthal Homo sapiens. In fact, as we saw last week, evolutionists say Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal did not evolve into Homo sapiens. Now they're saying Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal developed from Homo sapiens. That's still messed up, but see, they're starting to catch on. Second thing evolutionists say, we saw last week, first human beings did not come out of Africa. You remember all those quotes? They say they came out of Turkestan. What's Turkestan? On your map, it's that gray area down on the bottom. The gray area on your map going from approximately Turkey on the west over to the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley in the east. It's basically the footprint of the old Ottoman Empire. That's Turkestan. Why is that area so wide? Why would now evolutionists say that's where human beings came from? Why such a wide area? Evolutionists can't say why, but the Bible does, doesn't it? The Bible accounts for that gray area. Turkey on the west, what happened in Turkey? That's where the ark landed, and the three sons of Noah repopulated the earth. What's in the far east of Turkestan? The Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. That's where the Garden of Eden was. So the Bible says there were 2 beginnings of the human race, and it encompasses the footprint of Turkestan. The third thing that evolutionists tell us, as we saw last week, is this. All the fossils of our so-called ancestors, the primitive fossils, none of them are found in Turkestan. Now there's a serious problem, isn't it? If they say the origin of the human race was in Turkestan, wouldn't we expect to find some fossils of primitive beings in that area? You know how many were found? Let me say again, 0. None. In fact, they're not even close. Where are the fossils of our primitive so-called ancestors found? On the dots on your handout of that map. Not only are they not found where they admit human beings originated, they're found as far away as they could possibly be from there. The fourth thing that evolutionists now are telling us, by the way, they're telling us all this without giving up on their theory. I want to make that clear. But the fourth thing they're telling us is, all these fossils of these so-called primitive human beings, they look remarkably similar. They're scattered all over the world, but they look remarkably similar. And what do they have in common? What they have in common is, they all have features that are African and Oriental. Not both of those, it's kind of a mix. And evolutionists now are very puzzled because there's all these primitive fossils are clearly from one ethnic group that became Africans and Orientals. And by the way, Native Americans. Now, the evolutionists, they do not have an explanation for that. Do we? Yes, we do. Genesis chapter 10 says that Ham was the ancestor of the Africans, Orientals, and North Americans. That explains the unity. The fifth thing that we learned last week from evolutionists is this. One, since human beings originated in Turkestan. Secondly, since Cro-Magnon developed from Homo sapiens. And three, since all those primitive fossils are remarkably similar. Evolutionists now have concluded something. Again, not the Bible. Evolutionists have concluded this, that there was one historical event that happened in Turkestan that caused these, what we would call Hamites, to be, I'm going to use their words now, to be pushed out to the margins, to be the wreckage of a higher civilization, pushed out to the extremes of the earth. Those are all evolutionist words I just said. Some event in Turkestan caused Hamites to be scattered to the ends of the earth. Evolutionists don't have an explanation of what that event was. Do we? Yes, we do. Genesis chapter 11. The Bible says that Hamites, a group of, Hamites, left Turkey, went to the eastern part of Turkestan, to the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and built a tower, and had a very high civilization, very quickly. And then God scattered them, these Proto-Africans and Orientals, to the margins of the world. So obviously, the dots we see on our handouts there, those are the Hamites that were scattered. Now, why did God do that? The reason was this. Remember, God had intended for the three families of man to work together, based on the gifts that the families have. Ham is extremely gifted in design, technology. You put Ham in the desert, he'll survive. Japheth will die. Ham can survive. Put him in the La Brea tar pits of California, he'll survive. Put him in the Arctic, he'll survive. Not only survive, he'll design a way of life. So God's intention was that Ham move out first from Turkey, design a way of life, and then Japheth would follow. Japheth was to be enlarged upon the earth. Japheth was to bring government as he gradually expanded on the earth. But only after Ham had carved out a civilization. Ham carves out the civilization, Japheth follows. And then Shem. Shem accompanies Japheth. What did the family of Shem have? The knowledge of God. The knowledge of salvation through Jesus Christ. That's how God intended the world to develop. Ham goes first, designs a way of life. Japheth follows with the government. But Japheth comes, as the text says, in the tents of Shem with the gospel. That was what God intended. At first it looked right. Ham did go out first after the flood. However, Ham refused to cooperate. Ham said, I'm not going to be the vanguard. I'm not going to pave the way for Japheth and Shem. I'm going to build my own tower, my own city, and I'm going to stay together. So God scattered them to the ends of the earth. And then, once they landed in their landing spots, and I'm beginning to be more inclined to think that God zapped them there. Now, it's possible that he supernaturally expedited their getting there. That's possible. But it says he scattered them to the ends of the earth. I wish I put it on the handout today. The word scattered is a word that's almost violent. God scattered them to the end of the earth. It's almost violent. God wasn't violent with them, but somehow he supernaturally put them to the edges of the earth. So isn't it interesting? God's first intention was that they go as a vanguard. They move out and Japheth and Shem follow. They wouldn't do it, so instead what did he do? He sent them to the end to begin with, and then as they started working their way back, that's where they met Japheth. See the difference? And by the way, that's what they did. I guess it's just human nature. As they were scattered to the ends of the earth, first thing they did was survive. Then they started moving their way back. And again, instead of Ham going before Japheth and Shem, God sent him way ahead, and as Ham was moving his way back, that's when he met them. More about that in a minute. But see now, that account in the Bible accounts for the geographical distribution of these fossils and also their identification. That explains who the Cro-Magnons are, I believe. But as we look at the areas where those Cro-Magnons were found, where the dots are, again, most of them are just clearly human beings. They're Africans, Orientals, Native Americans. But as they kept exploring around the area where those dots were, they started finding other skeletons that were clearly not fully human. And if we look at some of the examples, it looks like some of them certainly seem to be like half ape and half human. And those are what are called the Pithecus, Pithecus. So now we've already covered this so-called transition from Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal to Homo sapiens. Remember what the explanation is? It didn't happen. They developed from Homo sapiens. I'm going to talk more about Neanderthal today. But I want to look at this Pithecus character, because that is the so-called missing link. First thing we want to do is acknowledge something, and evolutionists would agree with this. It's very rare to find a complete skeleton of these Pithecus creatures. They've all been reconstructed in varying degrees. Secondly, certainly tissue is not preserved. So whenever we see these artist illustrations, we have to remember things like noses and ears and hair and skin color have been put there on speculation. Look at our graphics page, that page right in the middle. First, remember that we have this Pithecus, then Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, Homo sapiens. I want to start at the top. These are so-called Cro-Magnon men. Remember what the Cro-Magnons are in the accepted view? They're the first human beings, but they're very, very primitive looking. In fact, that drawing on the left up there is like Kemosabe something. And then look at the two guys to the right. Don't they look? They always have these Cro-Magnons looking kind of dumb and kind of vacant-stared, kind of beetle-browed. The guy standing up is saying something like, "Me catch rabbit." The guy squatting beside him is saying, "I wish I had some Grey Poupon." Are these accurate renditions? Well, maybe so, but maybe not. In the 1960s, there was a man in Canada, a professor, who started doubting the accuracy of some of these reconstructions. So he knew a forensic laboratory in Quebec where they specialized in doing these kind of reconstructions. In fact, they did two things. They did reconstructions of crime victims, and they did reconstructions of primitive fossils. So this man, his name was Arthur Custance, he went to this forensic lab in about 1960, and he brought that skull you see on the left. See the one below that Indian-looking creature? You have a row of three there. One on the right has a derby hat. See what I'm talking about? Okay, the skull on the left was a skull that he brought to the forensics lab. And he said, "This is a Cro-Magnon skull. Can you do a reconstruction?" The drawing to the right is the reconstruction. He took the skull back. He made it look superficially different, and he brought it back to the same forensics lab. He said, "This is a victim of a crime. I need you to do a reconstruction. All we know is the man wore a derby hat." That's the reconstruction they drew of the same skull. See the three right below it? I'm sorry I couldn't get a better picture of that. This is a laboratory in Europe who does the same thing as the Canadian laboratory. Forensics. They reconstruct skulls. So the skull on the left was brought to this laboratory, and they were told, "This is a Cro-Magnon man. We need a reconstruction.
You're down on the third line.
I'm on the third row, yes. We need a reconstruction. The picture in the middle was the reconstructed face. See how primitive he looks? Actually, the picture on the right is the real man. He was a broadcaster for the Algerian soccer team. Sort of makes you wonder about the credibility of some of their reconstructions, doesn't it? Now, do you see what I mean, though? Do you see the element of racism, or is it just me? They tend to say if you're not Caucasian, you're primitive looking. Now, those are the Cro-Magnons, the Africans, and Orientals. But remember, now I want to go back one step further, before that, supposedly, to the Pathicus. Remember what the Pathicus are? They're the ones that supposedly are the missing link between the apes, primates, and the first human being, which would be Cro-Magnon. And there are several Pathicus fossils found around the world. And these are the crowning jewel of evolution. Here's our evidence. Here's our proof. You can't deny the fossils. Like this beautiful creature down on the bottom. This was found in 1922 in Nebraska. In fact, he's called Nebraska Man. Actually, he's called Hesperopithecus. Didn't I put that on there? Yes, Hesperopithecus means ape man, and Hespero means from the west. So Hespero means western ape man. And again, this Hesperopithecus was hailed as absolute proof of evolution. Because he's clearly not human, but he's not really ape. And for 40 years, evolutionists said, if you don't believe in evolution, you're an absolute idiot. Because here's the proof.
Could be Bigfoot.
Well, let me point out, actually, there are a few little problems, okay, with Nebraska Man. Maybe they're not much, but I feel like I want to point them out. First, okay, the skeleton they found, okay, it was not exactly what you would call a complete skeleton. Not exactly. They found parts of it, and they had to reconstruct the rest. Actually, maybe I shouldn't have said parts. Because there was just the one part there. It was teeth. Well, actually, not exactly teeth. It was actually more like just the one tooth. Yeah. So you may be thinking, so did they reconstruct an entire skeleton from a single tooth? And the answer is certainly not. Don't be fools. I want you to know, for you skeptics, they found the entire fossil very nearby. The entire skeleton, they did find it. So there. Whew. Maybe it's important to point out something that technically the skeleton they found was actually a pig. So Nebraska Man, Hesperopithecus, was totally reconstructed from a tooth of a pig. But I'll tell you something. You look at evolution textbooks in college today, they still have that picture that I pulled that picture off of a modern textbook. Now, they've taken the verbiage out, I'll give them that, but they still put that picture in there as an example of a Pathicus.
Were there camels in Nebraska at that time? Yeah. Look at the upper left, right-hand portion of your picture.
I don't believe there were. But there were pigs, we know that. And one of them had a missing tooth. Yes, he still is. By the way, here's the textbook, Fossil Man. I found it in here. Fossil Man, a textbook of human paleontology. Still uses college textbooks, still have that picture. What about, but you're thinking, well, there were many other examples of Pathicus, and I'll say, of course there were. Certainly there were. There was Piltdown Man. He was found in 1910. Oh, that one looked good. There were clearly ape-like features, but there were also primitive human type features in the skull. In the whole skeleton. And they did have the whole skeleton this time. So don't start with this was a pig. No, they had the whole skeleton. In fact, it looked so good, it looked too good. In fact, in 1950, it was discovered it was a deliberate hoax. Somebody had intentionally gotten some Native American fossils, put them together with some animal fossils, even got a file and filed down some of the teeth to make them fit. That was Piltdown Man. I'm sure you heard of the famous monkey trial, the Scopes trial with Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow ridiculed Christians for being so idiotic they could believe in evolution when the facts are there. How can any idiot not believe the facts? The two facts he was referring to were Nebraska Man and Piltdown Man. You may be thinking, so is that it? And the answer is certainly not. What about Lucy, who was discovered in Ethiopia? That was another Pythecus. No question about that one. This was a chimpanzee who walked around, though. I mean, like a chimpanzee, but obviously humanoid because Lucy walked. Lucy was discovered in 1974. She's still listed in all the textbooks as a Pythecus transition. One thing they don't mention very often is that in 1982, Lucy was taken to University of California, Berkeley. They did a DNA structuring of Lucy, and Lucy's a chimpanzee. What about Peking Man? It's another one. Oh, he's a Pythecus. Now, Peking Man's a little bit different because they will admit that structurally speaking, just by his skeleton, Peking Man was an ape. But why do they call him a Pythecus? Here's why they call him a Pythecus. They said because he was using tools. I actually don't know if you'd call it a tool, really. Or if he was using it. What was found nearby was a stone club. And again, I don't know if this is important. Probably isn't. But the back of his skull was bashed in. I don't think he was using that tool. I don't think he was the user. I think he was the usee. What did he do? Bash himself in the head? What, was he so distraught about being an ape man? Larry, my buddy, evolved into Cro-Magnon. Everybody else evolving except me. I'm still Chester the ape man. Maybe he said, I hate my life, and just got that club and bashed his own head in. I mean, give me a break. Isn't it obvious somebody killed an ape? What about the rest of the evidence? I can tell you very simply, it's all like that. So am I suggesting that they've made up all the evidence for Pythecus? I would never suggest anything like that. I'm saying it openly. They made it up. There's no evidence. Now, here's a fair question. Am I qualified to say that there is no evidence? The answer is no, I'm not. But I know somebody who is. Person we saw last week, Richard Leakey. Remember the Leakey family? The premier evolutionist of all time. And Richard is of the Leakey family. He is the most avowed and respected evolutionist. So when I say all that evidence for Pythecus is made up, the reason I know that is he said it. Here's what we saw last week. I want to read it again. It's on your graphics handout at the bottom. Biologists would dearly like to know how modern apes, modern humans, and the various ancestral hominids have evolved from a common ancestor. He said they'd love to know. What does that mean? They don't know. Why? Unfortunately, the fossil record is somewhat incomplete. As far as the hominids are concerned. Now, hominids, he means the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal. Early humans. What he means is, now there's plenty of Cro-Magnon fossils. There's plenty of Neanderthal fossils. What is incomplete? Any sign whatsoever of a transition. going up. And look at this. And it is all but blank for the apes. Meaning, let me tell you, translate that. It is all but blank for the apes. That's a scholarly way of saying we made up Pythecus. It's blank. There aren't any. He means there aren't any viable, real Pythecus fossils. The best we can hope for is that more fossils will be found over the next few years which will fill the present gaps in the evidence. And here's the one I'm going to keep saying maybe. I can't believe he said this. I guess God gave him truth serum or something. If you brought in a scientist from another discipline and showed him the meager evidence we'd got, he'd surely say, forget it, there isn't enough to go on. For the record, that's Richard E. Leakey, The Making of Mankind, Michael Joseph Limited, London, 1981, page 43. So, would all the evidence fit that way? And the answer is yes. So we see when evolutionists tell me, or I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize. When Baylor University says, when Baylor University, a Christian university in Waco, says that the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Yeah, when Baylor University says that, they're buying in. And it really disturbs me because they're lying. They've caved in. And so what we have here, we have the biological scientific community telling us we're stupid if we don't believe in evolution. I guess they're forgetting that for 50 years they told us that we were stupid if we didn't believe in evolution because of Piltdown Man, Nebraska Man, and Peking Man, the ape that got his head bashed in. It's amazing. There's no evidence for it. It's the biggest scam maybe of all time. You know that scientists have tried desperately to reproduce evolution in the laboratory. Desperately. Because, see, the accepted view is that evolution happened because of two ways. Natural selection, like if some organism has a feature that will prosper in an area the other one doesn't, the one that will prosper will reproduce. That's true to a degree, by the way, and that explains why within species there is evolution. It's because of natural selection. For example, lizards that can change colors, they'll live, and they will live and have other little lizards, while the ones who can't do that will go extinct. So yes, within a species, there is some kind of minor evolution. But they're saying there's a macroevolution, meaning that from primitive life came all the forms of life throughout all the species. And that happened, they say, through mutations in DNA. So scientists now have gotten fruit flies. The reason they pick fruit flies is that a fruit fly will just live for 2 days. So be kind to one. So you can have many generations in just a few weeks of fruit flies. So what they've done, they've gone in and deliberately induced mutations in the DNA of these fruit flies, hoping desperately something new will evolve. They've been doing this for decades. So they have duplicated like billions and billions and billions of years of generations in fruit flies. What has happened to the mutations? Have mutations happened? Yes. All bad. Every one of them bad. They brought cancer, disease, nothing positive. And that's because it's doomed to fail. And that's because evolution violates a known scientific principle. And I wish some of these Christian scientists would have some backbone and say, this is bad science. They don't have to bring up the Bible. In fact, I wish they wouldn't. This is bad science. Someone needs to bring up what Richard Leakey said and said, Richard Leakey's saying there's no evidence. Violates the second law of thermodynamics. Second law of thermodynamics, also called the law of entropy, says that energy which is concentrated to begin with over time dissipates out. You have air in your tire, eventually it will dissipate out. We get older, we get tireder. Things that are wound up come unwound. Systems tend to deteriorate. It's the law of entropy because everything becomes more random. The second law of thermodynamics says nothing can get more complex with time. It becomes less complex. So we have this proposed scenario where over time, small little entities became complicated structures. It's unthinkable. And again, I wish somebody as a scientist would say, it's unthinkable. The amazing thing, though, is that evolutionists make the point for us. That's what I love about it. You don't have to know anything about evolution. Read what they say. What have they told us so far? They told us that the first human beings were Homo sapiens. The Cro-Magnons descended from them. Is that true? Yes, that's what happened at the Tower of Babel. It didn't happen in Africa. It happened in Turkestan. And evolutionists tell us that one group of those people, who remarkably looked like Africans, Orientals, and Native Americans, were pushed out to the margins. Now, once they landed, as I said before, what would have happened? By human nature, they began to work their way back. So really, the whole history of the world can be seen as waves of Hamites, starting at the perimeters. Think concentric circles here. They're starting at perimeters of the world. Over the centuries, they start moving their way back. Generally in the direction of Turkestan. Generally. Now, most of them don't make it back. Many of them stay in Africa, for example, and establish tribal cultures there. Some keep going and they stopped at Egypt and established a very good civilization there. They kept moving out. Now, and then, as they landed, here's what we want to think about. Here's where those ages come in. Stone Age, Bronze, Iron Age. You see, as they landed in their landing spots around the world, when those dots, immediately they were in the Old Stone Age. And let me point out what the Old Stone Age is. You know why it's called the Old Stone Age? I used to think when I was a kid that, well, the Old Stone Age is when they use very primitive stone tools, and the Middle Stone Age is when they use somewhat more sophisticated stone tools, and the New Stone Age, they use more complex stone tools. That's not at all what the Old Stone Age means. Old Stone Age just means this, that they were obviously using stones, but we're guessing because there's no historical record. So the Old Stone Age to historians just means prehistorical. That's all it means. But you see, isn't that what would have happened? They start off in their landing spots at the perimeters of the world. They're not leaving archaeological records, are they? Because what are they doing? They're hunting and gathering. So you see, the hunting and gathering stage of the human race did not happen there at the beginning in Turkestan. It happened afterwards as Ham is working his way back. And that's the problem with the accepted worldview. They want to put now they're using logic. I'll give them that. They're saying the first primitive people must be in Turkestan. And they're saying the earliest Stone Ages must be in Turkestan. They're using logic. But there's no evidence for that. In fact, there is zero evidence of any Stone Age civilization in Turkestan. You know where it is? It's all out on the margins. So again, doesn't that fit the model? They hit their landing spots out in the edges of the earth. Being Ham, he can survive. He becomes a hunter and a gatherer, but he starts working his way back. As he works his way back, his tools become more and more complex. I personally believe that we have an eyewitness to some of these waves of Hamites working their way back. And I believe it was Job. If you look at your map, the map at the bottom, or actually it's on the main handout. On the side. That's what I was looking for. Huh? The picture on the right side of the bottom. The map. The white area I'm going to talk about next week. That's where the ice ages were. But the big black dot, that's where Job lived. Right at the edge of Turkestan. And I believe Job was an eyewitness to these waves of Hamites coming back. Job 30, verse 3. I believe he's describing the human race that he's seeing around him. They gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation. They pluck mallow by the bushes. Their food is the root of the broom shrub. I don't know what that is, but it sounds bad. Who is he talking about? Where do these people come from? Job 35. They are driven from the community. The community in Job means the community of the human race. He's saying these are the people who were thrown out, and now they're coming back. And they're hunters and they're gatherers. They're eating broom shrubs. Job 30, verse 6. So that they dwell in valleys and holes of the earth and of the rocks. There's the cavemen. Were cavemen at the very beginning of the human race? No. Cavemen fit in with Hamites working their way back. Among the bushes, under the nettles, they're gathered together. And again, where did they come from? Job says they were scourged from the land. He's clearly talking about the Hamites who were sent out. Now they're hunters and now they're gatherers. Now let's think about this.
Okay. About what time was this?
About 4:30.
Was this?
Oh, when this happened? Oh. This would have happened about, what, you talking about Job specifically? Job is seeing this about 10,000 BC. That's why God put them there. He's determined they're going, they said, I'm not going to go ahead of Japheth. God says, okay, you'll go way ahead of Japheth and meet him coming back. So he put him in areas where pretty much the only way he could go was back. But on the other hand, just from knowing where the sun is, they would know in general how to work their way back. But most of them never did make it.
Well, they knew astronomy very well because when they built those ziggurats.
Yeah, that's true. They would exactly know where. In fact, I think they probably knew exactly where they were by looking at the stars because they could use the ziggurats and things to. Yeah, I think there was no problem knowing where they were and how to get back. But we have this interesting scenario in world history where we have. Think about this. Think about concentric circles. And think about, instead of thinking of the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age as a timeline, think of it in circles. But here's the evidence, and you tell me what fits. First, let me tell you what the evidence is not. The evidence is not that you have stone, bronze, iron as you move out, which would make sense. The evidence doesn't make sense. The evidence is, at the very perimeters is where you have the old Stone Age. As you zoom in concentric circles, you have the middle stone, New Stone Age, Old Bronze, Middle Bronze, New Bronze, Old Iron, Middle Iron, New Iron, as you get closer. What clearly did not happen was they did not start at the Iron Age and say, oh, the heck with this iron, let's use rocks. Right? So they weren't moving out and getting less cultured. They weren't moving out and becoming less technologically inclined. Obviously, what happened was, those ages were, once again, Ham working his way back and getting more sophisticated in his technology as he worked his way back to the middle. And that's what I wish somebody would write a book about. But you see, as they're going back, they began to meet Japheth. Japheth, who was gradually enlarged upon the earth. He was gradually moving out from Turkey. And they met various places around the world. For those of us in North America, that's exactly where Christopher Columbus met Ham, and where pilgrims met Ham on the east coast of America, because the people in the Labrador tar pits had migrated their way back. Which direction are they going? Back towards Turkestan. That's right. Where did they meet? On the east coast of America. Now, what about from Africa? Remember, now Ham is coming back. All over the world he's coming back. And all over the world he encounters Japheth and to some degree Shem. So let's think about this. When the evolutionists say out of Africa, there's some truth in that. It's just not the beginning of the human race. The migration from Africa back into Asia was not at the beginning. It was Ham working his way back. And you see, he's an African working his way back from Africa into Asia. So they find the African fossils in Africa. They're clearly migrating to Asia. It's not the beginning of the human race. It's Ham working his way. Now, so that happened in North America. It happened in Africa. Let's think about Ham now. Now he makes it back to Europe. And as Ham makes it back to Europe, now he begins to meet the Japhethites. Where have they come from? Again, they've come from Turkey. Now they're coming from Turkey, and they're over in Europe, and now they meet these Hamites who are working their way back. They begin to intermarry. And their offspring would have had mixed features. Partially Caucasian, partially Hamitic. Those were obviously the Neanderthals. And that's why Neanderthals are only found in Europe. And evolutionists now say that Neanderthals are fully human beings, and it's a race that died out. So obviously there was a brief period of time when Hamites intermarried with Japhethites. They had offspring with more Caucasian-type features, but that didn't last for some reason. They didn't continue doing that. Next week I'm going to talk a little bit more about that if you want me to, and more about the Ice Ages. Where do they fit in? And I'll tell you, accepted history cannot account for the Ice Ages. The Bible can. But I want to close by asking a question. Why are these evolutionists so absolutely obsessed with their view of evolution that they know there's no evidence for? In fact, they admit their evidence, none of it fits. In fact, if you just have a bullet list of everything that they concede, they are saying now virtually everything they say is wrong. Remember the quotes last week? You read it, you say, well, they're admitting everything that they're espousing is false. But they cling stubbornly to it. And the answer is obvious. Here's why they do it. Because, see, they're not really addressing the question, where did human beings come from? We always need to keep that in mind. They will say that's what they're asking. What's the origin of human beings? That's not really what they're asking. We can't be fooled. What they're really asking is, what is man? That's the real question. Because, you see, if human beings came from animals, then human beings are animals. Does that make sense? That's what they want. Frankly, they don't care. Africa, Asia, Lithuania, California. I have seen signs of evolution there, I'll grant that. You see, what they want to say is that human beings are just animals just because, but we evolved because of very fortuitous circumstances. Now, it is true, biologically, human beings are animals, and we can't forget that. I think it's fascinating that God made land animals and human beings on the same day. He made the birds and the fish on one day, and then he made the land animals and man on the same day. I think he's trying to make a little point. Biologically, we are animals. So we need to concede that point. We need to stop arguing that. Christians argue that point. No, don't argue that one. We are. Biologically, we're animals. Genesis 1:24-25, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind. Catch that? After their species. I guess that would be more like phylum. After their phylum. Cattle and creep. Oh, I hate creeping things. Makes you sound like some Peter Lorre crawling around or something. It just says moving things. And beasts of the earth after their kind. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind. The cattle after their kind. Everything that moves on the ground. And God saw it was good. Then on the same day, Genesis 1:26, God said, let us make man in our image. There's the difference. According to our likeness. Animals are created according to the likeness of their parent. We are created in the image of our parent, who is God. We have his image and his likeness. And we're different from the animals. And let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and the cattle and all the earth and over every creeping thing and moving thing that moves on the earth. See the difference? We're not descended from them. We rule over them. But it is interesting when scientists recently developed the human genome plan. Oh, that's a fascinating study they did. They totally mapped our DNA. And they found that there's a remarkable similarity between our DNA and the DNA of orangutans and chimpanzees. Well, duh. Shouldn't there be? We live on the same planet. We breathe the same air. We drink the same water. We basically eat the same food. It's either plant-based or animal-based. We're all subject to the same laws of gravity.
Well, we were made by the same creator.
Made by the same creator. So, of course. And I'll tell you something else. I got no problem with us being 98% similar to monkey or orangutan because of this. Take away the image of God in man, and he is an animal. Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. The point he's making in Genesis 1:24 through 27 is that animals are born after their kind, and we are born after our parents' kind, in the image and likeness of God. But there's a difference between human beings and animals. Now, as I said before, God has a covenant with the animals. He'll take care of them. Our little friends will be with us. But during this era, we're higher than the animals. Now, why do they want to make human beings animals? Here's why. If human beings are just animals, then we don't have to account to our Maker. Animals don't. Animals do things by instinct. They're a product of generations of instinct. Our dog does things, I can't fathom what the deal is, but there's some instinct thing going back generations that I don't get, involving sticks and bones and licking. You see, and animals can't help what they do. The best we can do, like our dog, we had to lock her in the kitchen today because we can't explain to her, if we put you out there, you will chew things up. She doesn't get that. She has separation anxiety. I don't know how to deal with it. How do you counsel a dog? Tell me about your mother. They are a product of instinct, developed over generations. They can't help what they do. They're not really responsible for what they do, in a way. But you see, if human beings are that way, or like animals, then human beings, we can't help what we do, and we're not responsible for what we do. And we're not responsible to anybody else. We're a product of evolution. We can't help it. See, animals don't have the concept of sin. In fact, it's absurd to even talk about sin, the concept of animals. That's what they want for human beings. To have no concept of sin. But see, God created human beings separately. Same day, same dirt, but separately, and crowned his image and likeness on us. And part of that means is that now we're aware we're sinners. And every human being is aware that he is. He may hide it, he may mask it, but he's aware that he is. But he didn't want to deal with that issue. He'd rather say, well, I do the best I can. I think the man upstairs will take that all into account. I've lived a good life. I've been a good person. I've never hurt anybody. They always have never killed anybody. They don't want to address the fact that they're sinners. And they got to be reconciled with God. I've always wondered how people can embrace a theory like evolution that is absolute, utter nonsense. I think most people embrace it because they trust biologists and scientists to not foist some kind of absurd theory on them. But I frankly don't see, I'm sure I'm going to offend somebody, I cannot fathom how any person who looks at the evidence could be so stupid as to buy into a foolish theory like that evolutionists admit has no evidence. But I know why. Because evolution fits what people want to think. Nobody wants to be accountable for his sins. Nobody wants to deal with God on the basis of judgment of sins. And evolution provides the way out. That's why people obsessively cling to it. Because you see, the only way sins can be dealt with is through the penalty. Right? You got to pay the penalty. And what's the penalty? It's death. Separation from God. So human beings have a choice. They can take that penalty themselves and have death. Not really death, it's eternal consciousness in hell. Now, the only good thing about people in hell, there is one good thing. The penalty's paid. Somebody's in hell forever, God has no problem with that person anymore. Because he's paid the penalty. The wages of sin is death. He's paid the penalty. God has no problem with the person anymore, but the person has an eternal existence of absolute misery. Equivalent somewhat to being locked into a coffin alive for eternity. That's hell. But God had a way out, and that's to provide a substitute, Jesus Christ, who, by the way, came not as a primate, not as a pathekos, but as a Homo sapiens. And the reason Jesus came as a Homo sapiens was to identify with us, because that's what we are. We're not products of pathicus, whatever. He came to identify with us so he could be our substitute. And that's what people don't want to say. People don't want to say, I can't stand before God on my own. I can't stand before God and say, and look at my life and not deserve to go to heaven. People cannot accept to bear that, especially morally good people. I know very morally good people who I know very well they're anticipating the judgment seat saying, here's my life, it's been very good, and thinking that on the basis of very good life they'll go to heaven. And they don't want to face the fact that one sin keeps them away from God, and the only remedy is that somebody else had to die on the cross for your sins. People don't want to take that. So what is man? David asked the same question, Psalm 8, verse 3. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you've ordained. By the way, evolutionists say, what an amazing circumstance that all that happened. David says, what is man that you take thought of him? And here's Hebrew poetry. What does it mean for God to take thought of man? The next line explains it. And the Son of Man, that you care for him. Yes, God cares for the animals, but God cares for the human beings enough to send his Son to die for their sins. Yet you have made him a little lower than God. You catch that? A little lower than God? That's not a product of evolution. And you crown him with glory and majesty. And let me point out, every human being was originally crowned with glory and majesty, but it was lost at the fall. So we were born the first time in Adam, just like an animal. I'll give them that. But when we were born again by trusting that Jesus Christ was our substitute, then we were crowned with glory and majesty. I love the Amy Grant song she wrote for kids years and years ago. What a great children's song. And the words are, I have not descended from monkeys, though you may be fooled at first glance. I'm the child of God, my Creator. I'm not a product of chance. It's a great children's song. It's a great adult song, too. Next week, I'll look at the Ice Ages. Also, dinosaurs. And then as we go along the next few weeks, I want to start integrating the first civilizations we find in the Bible. The first ancient ones, and how that all does together to bring us up to Abraham. Anybody have any questions about this morning?
Well, Johnny, I think it's people want to believe what they want to believe, but it's also spiritual warfare with Satan wanting individuals to not recognize.
And that is I'm glad you pointed that out. That's something I should have added. Another reason people cling to it so tenaciously. This is one of the most brilliant farces ever developed by satanic forces. Absolutely amazing. Not only to develop it, but to get people to buy into it when they themselves say there's no evidence for it. It is a spiritual warfare. Father, again, we thank you for your word. We thank you that you indeed do have the answers. We thank you that you created us, yes, from the dirt, just like the animals, but that you crowned us with glory and majesty. You gave us your image and your likeness. We also recognize that because of the fall, that image and likeness was terribly marred, and that we were born with just a vestige, a remnant of that image and likeness. Oh, but you loved us. And because you loved us, you wanted to reconcile us to you. You did it the only way you could, by sending your own Son to be our substitute as a human being, a fully functioning Homo sapiens, so that he could be our substitute and pay the penalty we should have paid on that cross. We thank you in him, and we ask that you would be with us until we meet again, or much preferably, until you come for us in the air. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.